This is a particularly special edition of the Wheeler Institute COVID webinar series because we have with us for the next hour none other than Tony Wheeler. Tony Wheeler, the co-founder of the Lonely Planet publication series with his wife Maureen. Tony and Maureen also funded very generously the Wheeler Institute for Business and Development, which, as many of you know, focuses on the impact of business among those in developing and emerging markets and disadvantaged communities. And those of you who are regular followers of our webinar series, you also know that for the last couple of months or a little earlier, as the COVID pandemic has hit the world, one of the many things that the Wheeler Institute has done, in addition to funding research on the topic and beyond, in addition to convening people together on Zoom and many other platforms, in addition to rethinking our approach to education, especially experiential education in developing countries. Today, Tony will be joined by George Looker. George is a brand new graduate of the London Business School, MBA 2020. Tony had graduated from London Business School in 1972, so a different generation of
generations
of MBA students. Now, Tony, when he graduated, decided to spend, Tony and Maureen decided to spend a year traveling the world, or traveling from London, ending up in Australia, which is where he's joining us from, Melbourne, Australia at the moment. George, after an impressive career in as a political advisor, as a special assistant to the Secretary of Education in the United Kingdom, and as a consultant, George will be, perhaps you'll get some time to travel as well, George, but I know that you will be joining Amazon as a fresh graduate of London Business School. More to come, but for now, let me hand things over to George and Tony, and I will disappear and be back again soon.
Tony, before we focus on the core of today's conversation, I also want to echo some of what Rajesh said and say thank you not only for your time today, but also yours and your wife Maureen's generosity and vision for the Institute. Certainly it's been timely with all the support that it's been providing during the pandemic, and it's been amazing for me to be a project officer and play a part in the series of fascinating conversations that the Institute has been able to run throughout the last few months. It's been a privilege to have a ringside seat for those conversations between economists and entrepreneurs and humanitarians and academics and various commentators. I know that's only a small part of what the Institute does, but on behalf of students at the school, I just wanted to say thank you as well. So Tony, we've been in lockdown in the UK for just over 100 days, and we're hopefully about to re-emerge into the world. I know you're in Australia at the moment, but where were you when lockdown measures started to be put in place, and how have you, a legendary world traveller, coped with having to stay in one place for such a prolonged period of time? What have you missed the most during lockdown, and where do you think you're going to go once you're able to travel freely again?
Well, you said 100 days, and I actually just looked, and I've been back in Australia for 105 days. Wow. So, that was pretty much as the ordeal hit the fan. And I was actually in Yemen when all this started to go seriously wrong. I was on the island of Socotra, which is the south. It's part of Yemen, but it's the south of the main part of Yemen in the Indian Ocean. It's been described as the Galapagos of the Indian Ocean. And I was there for a week-long stay. And suddenly we got this message that we had to evacuate. We had to fly back to Cairo because the world was about to shut down, which is essentially what I did. And I flew back to Cairo. I flew on the next day to Australia, and I arrived here in time to be self-quarantined, self-isolated for 14 days. I couldn't go home. If I'd gone home, I would have pushed Maureen into self-isolation as well. So I ended up in an Airbnb for 14 days. But if I'd arrived just a few days later, it would not have been a case of self-isolating. It would have been a case of being seized by the government and put in quarantine and shut down and the door, locked, you're not allowed out. So in a way, I was here at a luckier time. But yeah, I've been here now for 105 days and I'm getting very itchy feet. This is not normal at all. I've got to say, I have seen one of the things we're talking about when we do start to travel, we will travel more locally at first. And if you're in London, that's going to mean travel in Britain or travel with Britain and Ireland or travel around Europe. You're not going to be thinking about going to, certainly not to South America, certainly not to North America, the way the United States is going, certainly not to Asia and Australia. So that the travel is going to be local at first. And essentially that's what I've been doing. I have been doing a little bit of travel, but within Australia, and even not very far in Australia, because we're having a bit of a second wave here in Victoria, in Melbourne. And as a result, we're virtually not allowed out of Victoria. We can go to Sydney, we can't go to the Barrier Reef, to Queensland, South Australia, Tasmania, the Red Centre. That's all just shut off. So it's a strange time.
It's interesting, you're talking about doing more local domestic travel. And I was reading something earlier in the week. Brian Chesky, the CEO and co-founder of Airbnb, he said that travel as we know it is over and it isn't coming back. So, do you agree with him? What do you think, domestically or internationally, do you think the experience will be, how different will the experience be for travelers that are just looking to either go on a relaxing holiday or want to see the world as a family? What do you think is going to change most significantly about the experience?
I half agree with him, because whatever comes, travel will come back. There's no question of that. We can look at all sorts of times in the past, after 9/11, when for a spell terrorism shut travel down. In Britain, we've totally forgotten that in Britain there was the mad cow disease phase, which really shut down travel in Britain. And at that time, I was involved with the Youth Hostel Association, and a lot of youth hostels around Britain were shut down because you couldn't go out into the country. So we forget that, we don't forget, we know there have been other occasions when travel has been badly hit and it came back. This is a bigger hit. There's no question. This is a bigger hit in all sorts of ways. So I think that when it comes back, it's not going to just jump back to suddenly we're going everywhere and EasyJet are in full operation and Emirates are flying you all around the world. That is not going to happen. That's going to be different. And I think one of the things we have to look at is, I think, wasn't it Churchill who said that there's no crisis you don't get some mileage out of? And, we should look at some of the improvements we can make in travel. I think there's no question that we did, to some extent, over-travel. There was, the whole over-tourism thing. Remarkably, a week or two before I was in Socotra, I was in Japan at an over-tourism conference. And that's a problem. We have totally solved the over-tourism problem. Nobody is worrying right now about over-tourism. They aren't sitting around in Barcelona and saying, oh my God, there's so many people walking down the Ramblas. That is absolutely not happening. Well, when we do get back to travel, maybe that's one of the things we're going to look at a little bit more seriously.
Definitely. We'll go back to over-tourism, because I think, as you say, it's a really interesting trend that I know that you were focusing on before coronavirus hit, and also kind of seeing some of the impacts. But seeing as we've got so many participants on the call today, I'd like to get a bit of a sense of when the audience thinks that their own travel patterns will resume. So if we could bring up the poll, it will ask, when do you think you will return to the level of travel that you had before the pandemic? So this summer, once governments are able to agree on air bridges and we're allowed to travel again? Or do you think it'll be next year, 2021? Do you think it'll be 2022, perhaps once we have a vaccine and some of the concerns about travel have been eased? Do you think it'll be another time in the future? Or do you think you're never going to return back to the level of travel that you had prior to this crisis? Do you think this is going to be a permanent change in your travel patterns?
I put my submission in there. Oh, look at that! I'm with the majority. We're all thinking 2021. But you
I
know,
guess,
I agree that last line, never. There's a certain amount of truth in that, because we are never going to get back to the way it was before the pandemic. There's going to be all sorts of changes that are here with us forever, and that's pretty much the same thing. Well, you know, after 9/11, you know, the security stuff that came in, it's been there ever since. You know, we expect now to be looking at the liquids we put in the bags. We expect to be going through the X-ray machines. We expect to be thinking, do I need to take my belt off? Are my shoes okay? Those things, you know, are now, they're here. We're not going to change them. And it'll be the same thing after this. There'll be lots of things that we don't even know yet what they really are. I mean, I suspect we're going to be asked to prove our health before we get on the flight. When the vaccinations come in, they're going to be saying, okay, where's your vaccination certificate? Right now, they're going to be taking your temperature. There's going to be minor things and later on major things that will be here forever.
yeah, it's really interesting. And some of those changes, I'm interested, you know, you obviously have a lot of experience working with people within the sector, whether they be hotel operators or running restaurants and you know, other sorts of, you know, airlines and aspects of the travel value chain. Now that we're in this phase of gradual reopening, and obviously our business school audience thinks that by 2021, just over half of us will be returning to our typical travel patterns. What do you think that the sector needs to do from a managerial and a business perspective to adapt to what the consumers will want? You know, is there going to have to be, what are you urging, you know, people who own or manage hotels and restaurants and other elements of this value chain to be focusing on so that, you know, they are able to bring customers through their doors again?
Well, I think, you know, obviously they're going to be impressing us with how much hand sanitizer they have and how well the room is cleaned. And, you know, there's been a lot of talk about we're never going to see the minibar again because, you know, we shouldn't anyway, it's a waste of money. But, you know, the minibar, who knows whose hands have been in that, handling the bottles or feeling the chocolate bars before they take them out. We're never going to see the buffet breakfasts again, because there were things where people went and they pushed things around and picked them up and thought about them and breathed over them. You know, there's going to be lots of changes that, at least in the short to medium term, they're changed forever. The hotel buffet being breakfast buffet being a really good example. So I think that the operators are going to have to convince people that it's okay. And, you know, we're running these experiments. I look every day and, you know, we've had experiments, you know, Sweden and Brazil both ran experiments, which the results have not been very good. Right now, Europe and the European Union is running an experiment. You know, we can all go out there and, well, not everybody, but those who are the leaders in this going out there, and I'll be in a month's time going to decide, well, it wasn't that bad. You know, we went there, we spent some time, we came back, we haven't got the virus, everything's okay. You know, a smaller, quite large in some ways, all around the world in the last few weeks, there have been lots of protests over the Black Lives Matter question. Here in Australia, we had two big ones, one in Sydney and one in Melbourne. They're now 3 weeks ago, and, you know, nothing has really popped up. There was a lot of talk about, you shouldn't go there, you shouldn't do it. And, you know, if you do go, well, hell is going to break loose. And basically all hell has not broken loose. And we are running these experiments all the time. Now, I think a lot of people are going to have a lot of fun looking at the figures later on and working out what worked and what didn't work.
Yeah. And in terms of some of these experiments you were talking about, either run by local administrators or national governments, or perhaps kind of, you know, multilateral bodies, what measures would you like to see the government put in place to support the travel industry? You know, my fear, for example, is that we see small independent hotels and smaller challenger airlines going out of business, replaced by ever larger global chains and national carriers. And I'm worried that post-coronavirus world has limited choice for consumers and price increases, which, really worsen the customer experience. So
yeah, I agree. I 100% agree. I think one of the things that's been said is that when it comes back, when travel comes back and we start to be able to travel again, it's going to be people who can afford it. That if there are less flights and they have to be less crowded, the prices are going to go up. And if there's more isolation and not so many hotel rooms are going to be open, it'll be more expensive. And I don't want to see that. It's okay for me. I can afford it personally, but I want to see young people still able to travel. I don't want to see them locked out because they can't afford the price tag. But I think there's going to be lots of things. Things will come out. The one sector of travel which has been really hit by the coronavirus, and as you know, and we're looking at how is it going to come back, and it's also been taking on a huge amount of blame for it, has been the whole cruise ship business. And I think the cruise ship business, I'm not a, well, some places you go to, if you want to go to Antarctica or the Arctic, you go on a cruise ship, a small one perhaps, but nevertheless, you go on a ship. But the huge ones, they haven't appealed to me, but they do appeal to a lot of people, and I won't knock that. But I think that there was a lot of bad side of the cruise industry, and the fuel they use, the way they take advantage of tax breaks and flags of convenience. And in the Caribbean, if you keep the cost down, we'll go to your island. If you don't, we'll cross you off and go somewhere else. I think the cruise ship business, they did have a multitude of sins, and I think that they're going to have to come back as a cleaner operation before we really like them again.
And what do you think about opportunities, especially with everyone having a bigger focus, hopefully, on climate change and decarbonisation, opportunities for, increased perhaps rail travel, or, you're talking about domestic travel, will people be able to, change their habits, the way that they travel in a way that reduces their kind of carbon footprint?
George, I think you're 100% correct there. We've gone on for years about, the carbon emissions go up and up and up, and what can we do about it? We can't do a thing. And then suddenly, we can turn the world upside down, and every flight in the world virtually is shut down. We discover we can do. It's not very comfortable what we had to do, but we could do it. And I think when travel comes back, there certainly was a certain amount of travel that was in many ways unnecessary. We don't need to be going off every weekend for a booze up with the boys on the other side of Europe. That isn't really necessary. If you want to get drunk, you can get drunk just down the road. We don't need to go to Prague to do it. So I think that there's going to be some changes, and they're not all bad changes. I think some of them are going to be good things. We are going to pay more attention to our local environment, and certainly at first there's going to be more local travel. I think that's going to be the first thing that comes back. And that's in some ways not a bad thing. But on the other hand, one of the things that really has concerned me about this is we sit at home and, in the developed world, and me in Australia, you guys in Europe, you see all the problems that are there right in front of you. You see that people are not going to work, they're working from home, that this is less crowded, that's more crowded, the things have changed, but we're not seeing what's going on in the outside world. And I've had contact to various places where suddenly all the international tourists have dried up. And if you were in a business where your business was 90% or 100% international tourists, suddenly having no tourists at all is just a huge blow. And I really feel for those countries where that has just hit them like a sledgehammer.
Yeah, and obviously, the focus of the Institute is looking at developing markets and frontier economies. So I think it's a really, really critical thing that we talk about and think about. But what do you think, tourism looks like in parts of the world where perhaps access to infrastructure and access to healthcare facilities is limited. I, for example, I was in Myanmar just before lockdown struck with London Business School, actually, on one of the global experiences. It's a beautiful country, some wonderful hotels, and a growing tourism industry. But the worry is that COVID-19 will, be a permanent setback for places like this.
I think it'll be, no question. Right now, it's a huge setback. It's a 100% setback right now. But I don't think it's going to be a permanent setback. And I think there'll be people who think, oh, I went to Myanmar when it was Burma still many years ago, when it was empty. There just weren't any tourists there at all. And the standards were, there were an awful lot of mosquitoes in your room, and the electricity only worked sporadically. And a lot of the comforts that we developed later on were not there. And then, I saw it grow and grow. And now it's, before the pandemic crisis, it was one of those countries worrying about over-tourism. And now it's going to be back the other way. And there'll be people who think, well, this is the opportunity to go. I just got an email from a friend of mine who lives in Phnom Penh in Cambodia. And he sent me a bunch of photographs of empty Angkor Wat. And he's saying, God, if you had the opportunity to go to Angkor Wat, now is the time to go there. There's no crowds at all. You've got the place to yourself. So I think there will be a certain amount of that as things start to reopen. There'll be people thinking, wow, I can go to Venice when the cruise ships aren't coming in, obscuring the view of all the wonderful churches.
Where's top of your list to go now that, once these places reopen?
Well, I look first of all where I didn't go this year, because I was, after I'd got back from my trip to Yemen, I was going to South America, and I was going basically to two countries I'd not been to before, Uruguay and Paraguay. And remarkably, those two countries have been two that have done very, they've not been hit by the virus as bad as other places. And you've got to hand it to Uruguay. They border with Brazil. Here's one of the worst places in the world. And Uruguay seems to have just escaped from it. And are they a little non-island New Zealand? Have they done all the right things? I don't know. But Uruguay and Paraguay was where the first place I didn't go to. So, I'd like to get back to those two places. I've still got my ticket. I'm still ticketed to fly there. I can reinvigorate the ticket if flights start again. The other three places later this year, I was planning on the 1st of September to meet a bunch of friends, including a couple of LBS graduates, in Athens to do a trip around the Greek islands. Well, right now it's crazy, because if you're coming from Britain, you cannot go to Greece. Now, I can go to Greece. For Australians, the Greeks say that's okay, but I can't leave Australia. So, we've got half of my group can't go there, and the other half can't leave the country to go there. So, Greece is totally crossed off at the moment.
Yeah, it does seem difficult to plan these trips that are supposed to be happening right now, and getting people coming from all corners of the world will be a challenge, I'm sure.
It will be, absolutely.
And I think because we've got we're talking to a business school community, I guess also be interested to hear your thoughts about business travel and any kind of permanent changes that you think will happen. Obviously, whether it's going to be replaced by video conferencing. As a former consultant, I was very familiar with airport hotels and flying in every Monday and Thursday to various clients. What do you think that impact of more working from home will be? Again, not necessarily our own personal habits, but for the tourism and the travel sector at large, because that's quite a profitable.
I think there's a bunch of questions. That's a really relevant point, George. And I think there's a bunch of questions there. One, of course, is we have got more used to working from home, and we're all adept at Zoom meetings and so on. But I actually went to a board meeting last week, the first one they'd had since it all started, in the office where there was nobody else there. Everybody else was working from home. And the CEO of this company was saying, yeah, this has worked fairly well. We've got through it fairly well. But it's not like being in the office and, kicking ideas around and meeting face to face. It's a poor substitute. So I think in that respect, we will want to get back to real life, to actually living with people and getting on with them. But on the other hand, there is going to be a certain amount of people saying, well, lots of things I could do from home. And I think there's a wider perspective of that. You think, well, it used to be that home was a convenient tube ride from the office. And now we're thinking, well, I could live miles out in the country where the cost of a house is cheaper. I could get more real estate for my money. Why do I need to live close to the office? So this may be a total upheaval, not just in the sort of business and office things, but in the real estate and real life things. But another thing that I think is going to happen is that we've had this situation in recent years where, I think probably Amazon is a good example of it, where you're going, but all the digital businesses, they're all operating out of Dublin. They're avoiding taxes, which is much the same as the cruise ship companies and flags of convenience avoiding taxes. And airlines, they get their fuel. They don't pay tax on fuel the way that other businesses do. And I just wonder, when we come out of this the other side and governments really they're going to be short of money. They've been pushing money out to keep the economies afloat. And they're not going to be so happy about the digital businesses who they allowed to set up in Dublin and avoid tax in all the rest of the European Union by paying a pittance to Dublin. So I think there's going to be lots of things like that, where suddenly we're looking at things with a little more seriousness.
And in terms of those government interventions, I think it's a really important one. And let's maybe go back to what we were talking about with developing economies as well. And thinking about, I was reading about Kenya, for example, that obviously is hugely reliant on tourists coming to safaris and going to that part of the world and spending their money in order to fund education projects, healthcare projects, all sorts of other side benefits from tourism in parts of the world like that. What do you think we should be doing, as people that look at the travel industry across the world, to make sure that money is going to the right places, to those that need it, to make sure that all of the supporting infrastructure and all the mouths that are being fed through tourism
George,
end up still being supported?
I think you're totally correct on that one as well. We do need to go back, and I've seen this in too many places. After the huge earthquake in Nepal, which devastated that country, there was a push. Very not immediately, because everyone think, oh, Kathmandu, has fallen down. All the hotels won't be there, and the trekking routes are closed. But there was a push after a while to say, go back. We want you to come. From the Nepalese, we want you to come back and bring your money back to us. And similarly, a lot of people thought, that this is something I should be doing. And I think that is going to be a situation in a year or two. We're right now in Europe, people are thinking, can I go on holiday to Spain or Greece or France or whatever? But I think a little bit further down the line, we're going to be thinking we should get back to these other countries as well, because previously our tourism businesses supported them and they need it. I think African countries are a good example.
Yeah. Okay, and so I think we're getting towards the end of our conversation, but I'll leave you with a final question, which is, do you have any hopes? What would you sort of like to see, as the positive impact, long-term positive impact of, this crisis that's obviously, been incredibly painful around the world, but is there anything that you see as your kind of main positive outcome?
I do hope, we do think of the world in a wider sense, that we realize, okay, our particular situation, we may personally be suffering, or other people we know close to us and in businesses we're associated with, but we're a wider world, and we have to think of that as well. And I think this has really hit the world in a wider sense, and I really think we've been in many ways insulated from it, because we haven't been out there seeing what what the situation is in the, we're cut off at the moment. When flights aren't going and people aren't coming back and saying, I saw this, I saw that, we just don't know what's going on effectively. And I really hope we do reach out to the wider world when the doors reopen.
Absolutely, no, I think that's true, and certainly, the work that the Institute does, and also, through London Business School, all the different global business experiences, that hopefully, that can all restart very quickly, because I think it's a really valuable part of certainly my education, my MBA program, but everyone's around the world.
It's very important, and I think that's what I've, it's been the reason I liked the whole concept of the Wheeler Institute, that it isn't just looking at the developed world, it's looking at the wider world. And that, that's, my business was always the wider world. And I don't want to forget that.
Great. I think I'll pass you back to Rajesh now.
Thank you.
Thank you,
George. We will see you shortly. Tony, while George has been asking you questions, I have been scrolling through the list of questions we've been receiving, and there have been quite a few. The first, and I'm going to group some of these questions together because I detect some themes and quite a few questions, and that's wonderful. The first question, Tony, is around what I would call the democratization of travel, and if we're going back to a past, if the future is more like the past, where it was the wealthy who could afford to travel beyond their local areas, it was the wealthy who could have their hands held or things planned for them to maneuver through various rules and regulations and have basically an organized package, kind of a tour that allowed them. Of course, your huge contribution to the world was to democratize travel, to allow the independent traveler to discover the world, often distant parts of the world, for themselves. And so the question, part of which is summarized by Catherine Armstrong, who says, regarding travel becoming more expensive, which is something you touched on, it's not just younger people who will not be able to afford travel, it's about the risk that only the very wealthy top percentage of people, mostly white, are the ones who get to travel and get the benefits of travel, some of which you were alluding to in your conversation with George. Are we risking another layer of ingrained privilege?
Yeah, we definitely are. I think, that's something we've touched on. And, I'm glad that Catherine brought up that idea that it isn't just necessarily we think of young penniless backpackers, but you don't have to be young to be traveling on a tighter budget. And yeah, that really does worry me, that that travel may revert to being something for the privileged and the well-off. We don't know where this is all going to go. I've really liked the quote that it's very hard to make predictions, especially about the future, because that is the situation. We are looking at projections about the future, and we don't know where this is all going to go to. I don't want to see travel locked down just to a certain specific group. There's nothing wrong with I've been talking with someone recently about Bhutan and Bhutan's approach to travel, and that they kept over-tourism away, but essentially by making it more expensive. And Bhutan is noted for all its Aman resorts, and I've stayed in the odd Aman resort. I've met Adrian Zechner, who started Aman's, and an interesting guy. But I don't want to see the world reduced to Aman resorts. I don't want to see Bhutan reduced to Aman resorts. So yeah, it does seriously worry me that when travel comes back, it may just be for the wealthy. But the other thing is the penniless are often the most intrepid. And one of the things I've suggested 100 days ago when I was about to go into lockdown, I said, are there going to be some people who don't go into lockdown, who just escape from it, you know, who go somewhere and right now are sort of sneaking across borders despite despite the fact that they're supposed to be shut out of these places, and are going from place to place. And there's going to be interesting travel books, interesting accounts in a couple of years' time or 5 years' time of what I did during the pandemic lockdown, how I went to places where there were no tourists at all because everybody was locked out except the intrepid few like me. And you know, if those people are out there, I have great admiration for them. They've disobeyed the laws. When they were told to go home and shut down and lock the doors, they ignored it. They went out and, you know, they survived. Great.
Well, you know, when you had emailed, I don't know, about now 2 or 3 months ago, to say you'd just been in Socotra and you were quarantining in Melbourne after you got back, I must say this has been a dream destination of ours, my wife and myself, for a long time. But then, you know, there were people who were stuck in Socotra when you managed to get out, and of course there have been some worse issues there. So I suspect there will be books written, or at least Instagram blogs, Instagram series done about.
Oh, there will be. There absolutely will be. I'm intrigued to see what comes out of this whole thing, because all sorts of things will come out of it. You know, we don't know yet what the story is going to be.
Exactly. Well, there are some nudges from the audience about the potential kinds of things that could come out, because we talked about 2 types of individuals: either those who are wealthy in money, or those who are wealthy in time. But a lot of people are time poor, and therefore cannot be those intrepid travelers who take a drive down to Yemen and then take a ferry to Socotra. They're also they're both money poor as well as, or at least not as well off, as well as time poor. Are we likely to see the return of travel agents, do you think?
Well, I've got to say, you know, my Socotra trip, I have to hand on kudos to my own travel agent, and I had booked that trip through a travel agent. Now, look, I'm someone who sometimes I do things through Skyscanner. You know, I book my flights that way, and sometimes I go directly to the airline, and sometimes I do this, sometimes I do that. But on that occasion, I had actually booked the flights through not my particular trip to Socotra. That was a totally separate one. But from Cairo to Cairo and from Cairo back to Australia was done with a travel agent. And, you know, suddenly everything was thrown up in the air. And as I arrived from Socotra back into Cairo, I sent a text message to my travel agent as the flight was taxiing into the terminal in Cairo. And I said, I'm back in Cairo 2 days earlier than I expected. Everything has gone totally head over heels. I've got to get out of Cairo before all the flights shut down. And before I got to immigration, my travel agent had changed my flight and got me a seat. And, you know, it was organized. And I was highly impressed. You know, I didn't know what I was going to do. And I was pretty sure I'd get out within a day or 2. It wasn't going to be the end of the world. But this travel agent had sorted it out. And I thought, if you needed an ad for why travel agents are good things, this was it. You know, they'd come through like, and I was fortunate as well that 1 a.m. in Cairo was working hours back in Australia. If it had been the other way around, I would have had to wait for another 10 hours till they got to the office. But I did this when the office was open, and they came through like a good travel agent would. So if you want to advertise for travel agents, I'm doing it right now.
Now, there are several questions, Tony, about, well, 2 topics. One around something you touched on, the environmental impact of tourism, sustainable tourism, and so on. The other around the role of government, because suddenly we're all Keynesians. The government is back in a big way in many parts of the world. And of course, this is a giant depending on how you count it, you measure it, anywhere from close to 4 trillion to 8 or 10 trillion dollars a year industry involving hundreds of millions of people around the world, the tourism industry and its offshoots. And so the government, as you mentioned, especially in certain countries that are extremely reliant on tourism,
Yeah.
governments have been actively involved. So two questions. First, around, this is from John Vermillier, who another wonderful entrepreneur in the travel and tourism industry. John asks, the big issue is accounting for the natural, social, and health externalities, so therefore the after effects of travel and tourism, and avoiding subsidies that have enabled some of these businesses to thrive, sometimes at the expense of the locations that are tourism spots. So if you had to sort of organize a subsidy policy on the part of government that ensures that the help gets to the individuals on the ground, and as you said, most disadvantaged, how do you do that?
I think, Rajesh, that's a very, very relevant question. And one of the places where I'm seeing that right now, I've been in some discussions with people in New Zealand. Now, when the pandemic crisis hit, New Zealand was another of those places like Venice, like Barcelona, like Amsterdam, that was really worried about over-tourism. They were concerned that there was really just too much tourism and that it was so much looked at in an international version that, there was too much of this, too much of that. Could the country, which had really sold itself as being a place that does, is a natural environment and does a lot of natural and nature things very well, was it being overwhelmed by the joys of tourism and the money that tourism brought in? And one of the concerns that they're having there right now is that they're trying to say, what's going to happen when the doors reopen, and who's going to decide what happens? Well, the obvious people are Tourism New Zealand. They're the New Zealand Tourist Office, and suddenly all these Tourism New Zealand people are all twiddling their thumbs, and dying to get back to work and earning some money. But their whole concept has been bringing in the international tourists. Tourism New Zealand had virtually nothing to do with local tourism. It was all the international side. And there are people who had this concern about New Zealand being over-touristed and the place being totally overrun by international tourists at the expense of any country, not any country, but most countries, a lot of tourism is local. If you go out around Britain, a lot of the people you see walking in the Lake District or doing bicycle trips or going to the theatre. I often say you go to the theatre in London, at intermission, there's a bunch of people who get up and leave because they've come from overseas. Part of their thing about going to the theatre is, I'm in Britain, I have to go to the theatre in the West End. Right, it's intermission, I've done it, I can leave now.
I've taken
people who, yeah, they've done that. They've done that side of it. The people who there's a probably if you did analyze the audience before intermission and after intermission, there'd be a much bigger international contingent before intermission than afterwards. Not right now, of course. There's no theatre, but the same problems there in New Zealand, and the New Zealanders who are worried about over-tourism and was it doing the right thing, are a little bit worried that it's going to be Tourism New Zealand, the organization that's only thinking about bringing in the international tourists, who set the goals and the guidelines for tourism after the pandemic. So yeah, we do need to look at this really carefully.
And if you could link that, there's an invitation to you as well as a comment which is from Jean-Pierre Saint-Hubert, who lives in Uruguay, and he welcomes you to eat some chivitos. And he says, how do you imagine governments from emerging markets where standards are not as controlled, how can they manage, and actually relatedly, by the way, entrepreneurs You know, what can they do differently?
They're obviously going to have to pitch to get their tourists back, because so many places the tourists have totally gone. And if you're in a country where, you know, in a way, places like England have it easier because, you've seen people flocking to the beach in Bournemouth. If they can't go to Spain or the Provence Côte d'Azur or to Italy or Greece, they're going to go to Bournemouth. And as I say, a lot of tourism is local, and you can get those tourists back. But if you're in a country where, and I think probably Kenya, you mentioned Kenya is a good example, where so much of that safari tourism and wildlife tourism and walking tourism, beach tourism, and so on is international, then you've been hit much more. You've got a much harder hill to walk back up afterwards.
On that point about local, of course, nothing is as local as your own armchair. And behind me are Lonely Planet books that Larissa and I look through and fantasize about places like Socotra. Mark Edwards, who writes from the very lovely but empty beaches in Mallorca, says, what is the future of travel books? With information so accessible now, is it about bringing the local people and their stories to life through photography and video?
Look, I think that's another very relevant question. And I'm not involved with Lonely Planet anymore, but I keep an ear out for what they're doing. And of course, they have been very badly hit. If people aren't getting on flights to fly places, well, first of all, Airbus aren't building the aircraft for them to get onto the flights to fly places. But secondly, they're not buying the guidebooks to use when they go there. And I know Lonely Planet are thinking, what good at the moment is it updating a guidebook? Because you don't even know which hotels are going to survive and still be in operation afterwards. You're going to be taking a bet that this one is going to come back and that one may not. So, guidebooks are definitely here. Look, guidebooks, it's another of those businesses that was in all sorts of transition before this hit. And this has just accelerated the process.
Huh.
I think people are still going to want information. I mean, I'm a great believer in information, and I look things, I use the internet as much as anybody else. It isn't the only thing I use. I use lots of other information as well. And certainly when I went to Socotra, well, there was no internet there. So, we could not look up things and say, well, what's the TripAdvisor recommendation for where we go tonight? Because the internet did not. Wow. It was there in a very, very slow fashion. It was best to get up at 4 a.m. if you wanted to get online and all. But no, it wasn't there. So having a guidebook that was either, in my case, downloaded or in print was much more valuable. Forget the internet. It wasn't there. And that's very nice. I mean, I do like to go to places where we don't have that immediate international connection.
Tony, we're coming to the end of our conversation. Just a question from our newly formed travel society at London Business School, which is actually a very nice way of perhaps summarizing some of the conversation. If you had to list, if we could put you on the spot and say, what are now, given everything you're observing, the big top trends? So if I'm an entrepreneur, if I'm an observer of the industry, what are the big top trends in the new world of travel? What would you say?
I think there's going to be a lot more travel of trying to do things on your own, where I reckon I've always been a keen cyclist. I've done some bicycle riding across countries in Africa and a little bit in Europe and other places. I've been on my bicycle today, so my bicycle legs are still aching from my ride this morning. But I think we could find that bicycle riding, there you are, you're out by yourself, you're totally safe, you're going to places that are not overrun by tourism. That I just read a wonderful account by a Lonely Planet author of last year. She spent 3 months riding from London to Istanbul. And I read her account and I thought, wow, that's it. If I was young enough and fit enough to do it, I'd like to have been chasing you down those roads. I think, things like that will will come back, and they may be a very good thing to look for. Look at a business angle that may work well. There's lots of elements of do-it-yourself travel, if you might call it. There have been car trips. We talk about the road trip coming back. That we want to do more road trips. That may well be a thing. Hertz has gone bankrupt. Maybe they'll come back next year, because if the US sorts out their coronavirus problem and people decide, well, now is the time to do that road trip across the US. And if not, there's lots of road trips in Europe that sound like they could be good fun.
Thank you so very much, Tony. As always, fun, fascinating, wonderful sets of insights and anecdotes. Thank you. I expect Socotra will feature on people's travel lists, among other places, and Uruguay for that matter. A couple of notes. I was remiss. I omitted something really important when I did the original introduction of George. I omitted to mention that if you go to the Wheeler Institute COVID-19 pages, you'll see 20 odd video interviews, much like this, 1 hour long, with some of the leading thinkers in the world on important topics that have to do with the consequences of the pandemic, with a particular emphasis on a topic I know that you mentioned as well, that's dear to your heart, around the developing countries and some of the disadvantaged populations living there. Now, if you go there, and if you don't have an hour to watch the recording, you will benefit from reading the very short summaries of each of these, wonderfully written summaries of each of these webinars that George has spent this summer until he joins Amazon. He has been spending much of his time as a project officer at the Wheeler Institute, writing those, watching us, maneuver our ways through webinars and summarizing the insights that these experts have provided. So, George, thank you very much for doing that. Over to you.
Thank you, Rajesh. It's been really interesting the last few months, as I said, really at the cutting edge of thinking and analysis about how the world can cope with this pandemic. And as you say, that focus on emerging and developing markets that's so important and critical for how business can support those economies as well. And I think that links to the conversation that we've had that was wide-ranging, but hopefully also optimistic, I think. Disappointing that Tony thinks that we've got the death knell for the hotel buffet. But I think it's, I think the clear message is that there's still definitely, while there might not be appetite for your full English breakfast, it's going to be appetite for travel to resume. And, a confidence that we need to have perhaps more or greater awareness about the environmental and human impact of travel, and thinking about some of these themes that, you're obviously really close to and passionate about, Tony, with regards to overcrowding and over-tourism. But fundamentally, travel and being able to see the world is really important for human curiosity, as well as various economies around the world. And I think that's very clear message that came from the conversation and all of your really interesting answers that you gave to our questions today, Tony. So thank you.
Thank you.